"This device isn't yours," Linda scoffed, gripping the tablet tighter. "Kids like you don't belong in first class, let alone own something like this." The golden morning light reflected off the polished exterior of Aurora Airlines as Antonio Reed, a 12-year-old boy, gripped his boarding pass tightly. His heart raced with excitement. This was his first solo flight to San Francisco, where his father was waiting. Wearing a simple gray hoodie, Antonio adjusted his leather backpack, a custom piece from his father's recent trip to London. Stepping onto the jet bridge, he inhaled the familiar scent of airports, coffee, jet fuel, and the faintest hint of expensive perfume trailing from the passengers ahead of him. Inside the aircraft, Aurora Airlines' first-class cabin was a world of luxury. Plush leather seats, polished mahogany accents, and a hushed atmosphere of exclusivity surrounded him. Passengers in designer suits and elegant dresses settled in comfortably, accustomed to this level of privilege. Near the entrance stood Linda Prescott, a veteran flight attendant with a keen eye for order. Her uniform was crisp, her blonde hair pulled into a precise bun, and her practiced smile greeted every passenger with professional warmth, until she spotted Antonio. Her expression stiffened ever so slightly as she stepped in front of him. "Excuse me, young man," she said, her tone polite but firm. "Economy boarding begins in 20 minutes. You'll need to wait." Antonio blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "I'm in first class," he said, holding out his boarding pass. "Seat 3. Linda took the ticket, her manicured nails tapping against the paper as she scanned it. A flicker of doubt crossed her face. "There must be some mistake," she murmured, narrowing her eyes. "This is a full-fare first-class ticket." Antonio straightened his shoulders. "Yes, ma'am. My father arranged it." Linda's lips pressed into a thin line. She glanced at his casual clothes, his hoodie, his sneakers. Her eyes lingered. "And where exactly is your father?" she asked, looking past him as if expecting an adult to claim responsibility. "He's in San Francisco. I'm flying to meet him." A businessman behind Antonio shifted impatiently. "Is there a problem?" Linda's polite smile returned instantly. "No problem, sir. Just sorting out a seating confusion." But Antonio felt it, that invisible wall, that unspoken assumption pressing down on him. It wasn't new. He had felt it before, when store security watched him more closely than other shoppers, when teachers seemed surprised by his test scores, when neighbors hesitated before believing he actually lived in his own house. He could feel it now, too. Antonio's grip tightened around his boarding pass. He had a choice: text his father or handle it himself. His father always told him, "Sometimes standing tall means staying quiet long enough to plan your next move." Antonio exhaled slowly. He knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Through calculated patience, there's a difference between backing down and strategic retreat. Antonio's father had told him that once during one of their Sunday chess matches, his deep voice calm yet firm. Antonio replayed those words in his mind as he sat stiffly in his economy seat, fingers hovering over his phone screen. 3 rows ahead, Dr. Elaine Whitaker observed the scene with knowing eyes. At 62, the distinguished neurosurgeon had witnessed decades of moments like these, small, insidious acts that spoke volumes. She watched as Antonio typed on his phone, his young shoulders burdened with an unfair weight. As the last economy passengers boarded, Dr. Whitaker gathered her designer coat and gracefully moved to the empty seat beside him. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, her voice warm yet dignified. "My seat neighbor in business class has a rather aggressive cologne." Antonio nodded, grateful for the company, but unsure of her intentions. "I couldn't help but notice what happened earlier," she said quietly. "I've had my fair share of Linda Prescotts over the years." Antonio's eyes widened slightly at her directness. "My father says I should document everything but not make a scene," he replied cautiously. Dr. Whitaker nodded. "Your father sounds wise. In my day, we had different tactics. The struggle evolves, but it never quite ends." Their conversation paused as Linda Prescott reappeared in the aisle, ostensibly checking seatbelts. Her gaze landed on Antonio's backpack, which was tucked partially under his seat. "That needs to go completely under the seat in front of you," she said sharply, ignoring identical violations from other passengers. "Yes, ma'am," Antonio replied, pushing his bag further down. Dr. Whitaker raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Antonio glanced toward first class. A boy about his age sat comfortably in seat 3A, dressed in jeans and a graphic t-shirt, nothing more formal than what Antonio wore. Yet Linda Prescott stood beside him, smiling warmly as she offered him a pre-flight beverage like a doting aunt. Dr. Whitaker leaned closer. "Your father, what does he do?" Antonio hesitated. His father's lessons in discretion deeply ingrained. "He's in business," he answered vaguely. What Antonio didn't share was that Malcolm Reed had recently acquired a controlling interest in Aurora Airlines through his investment firm. The deal had been kept deliberately quiet. His father preferred to assess operations from a distance before making his presence known. 30,000 feet above the eastern seaboard, the fasten seat belt sign flickered on as the plane hit turbulence. Passengers gripped armrests as the aircraft jolted through the rough air. Then, with one particularly sharp shake, Antonio's backpack tipped over, spilling its contents into the aisle. Among the scattered notebooks and headphones tumbled an advanced tablet, a sleek prototype from his father's tech division, one that wouldn't hit the market for months. Its titanium case gleamed under the cabin lights. Linda Prescott appeared instantly, her eyes narrowing. "Where did you get that?" she demanded, her voice loud enough for nearby passengers to turn. Antonio reached for it. "It's mine." Linda snatched it first, holding it up as if it were contraband. "This model isn't even available to the public." Dr. Whitaker's voice cut through the tension. "Young man, is that the new Reed Tech prototype? I read they were doing limited testing." Antonio nodded, surprised by her knowledge. "My father gave it to me," he said, extending his hand for the tablet. Linda clutched it tighter. "I find that hard to believe. These are reserved for executives and developers." Antonio exhaled, his patience wearing thin. "My father is Malcolm Reed. Through calculated patience, there's a difference between backing down and strategic retreat." Antonio's father had told him that once during one of their Sunday chess matches, his deep voice calm yet firm. Antonio replayed those words in his mind as he sat stiffly in his economy seat, fingers hovering over his phone screen. 3 rows ahead, Dr. Elaine Whitaker observed the scene with knowing eyes. At 62, the distinguished neurosurgeon had witnessed decades of moments like these, small, insidious acts that spoke volumes. She watched as Antonio typed on his phone, his young shoulders burdened with an unfair weight. As the last economy passengers boarded, Dr. Whitaker gathered her designer coat and gracefully moved to the empty seat beside him. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, her voice warm yet dignified. "My seat neighbor in business class has a rather aggressive cologne." Antonio nodded, grateful for the company but unsure of her intentions. "I couldn't help but notice what happened earlier," she said quietly. "I've had my fair share of Linda Prescott's over the years." Antonio's eyes widened slightly at her directness. "My father says I should document everything but not make a scene," he replied cautiously. Dr. Whitaker nodded. "Your father sounds wise. In my day, we had different tactics. The struggle evolves, but it never quite ends." Their conversation paused as Linda Prescott reappeared in the aisle, ostensibly checking seatbelts. Her gaze landed on Antonio's backpack, which was tucked partially under his seat. "That needs to go completely under the seat in front of you," she said sharply, ignoring identical violations from other passengers. "Yes, ma'am," Antonio replied, pushing his bag further down. Dr. Whitaker raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Antonio glanced toward first class. A boy about his age sat comfortably in seat 3A, dressed in jeans and a graphic t-shirt, nothing more formal than what Antonio wore. Yet Linda Prescott stood beside him, smiling warmly as she offered him a pre-flight beverage like a doting aunt. Dr. Whitaker leaned closer. "Your father, what does he do?" Antonio hesitated, his father's lessons in discretion deeply ingrained. "He's in business," he answered vaguely. What Antonio didn't share was that Malcolm Reed had recently acquired a controlling interest in Aurora Airlines through his investment firm. The deal had been kept deliberately quiet. His father preferred to assess operations from a distance before making his presence known. Linda let out a sharp, disbelieving laugh. "And I'm the Queen of England. Security will meet us upon landing to sort this out." She turned sharply, tablet in hand, leaving Antonio frozen in his seat. Dr. Whitaker placed a steady hand on his arm. "Call your father, young man." Now, in his San Francisco office, overlooking the bay, Malcolm Reed's phone buzzed with an incoming text. His assistant watched as the normally composed executive's expression darkened dangerously. "Cancel my afternoon meetings," Malcolm instructed, already dialing numbers. "And get me the direct line to Aurora Airlines Chief of Operations." Back on Flight 1342, Linda Prescott stood rigidly in the aisle, clutching Antonio's tablet like it was a piece of damning evidence. Her voice carried through the cabin as she addressed the surrounding passengers. "This young man appears to have property that doesn't belong to him. We take security very seriously on Aurora Airlines." The accusation hung heavy in the air. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably. One businessman glanced at Antonio, then quickly averted his eyes. Antonio felt the familiar tightness in his throat, the same suffocating sensation he'd felt too many times before in stores, at school, in places where people assumed he didn't belong. But this time, something shifted inside him. The embarrassment that had burned his cheeks earlier cooled into something steadier, sharper. He sat straighter, his voice level as he met Linda's gaze. "That tablet is registered to me. The serial number and activation are linked to my account." Dr. Elaine Whitaker watched with quiet approval. She recognized what was happening, had seen it in so many young men before. This was the painful but necessary evolution, the moment black children first learned to defend their dignity without sacrificing their composure. Linda's lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll let airport security determine that. Until then, I'll be keeping this safe." The cabin phone rang. A younger flight attendant picked up, then glanced toward Linda with a puzzled expression. "Linda, Diane needs to speak with you. Urgently." Diane Reynolds, the chief flight attendant. With 25 years of service, she never interrupted mid-flight unless it was serious. Linda hesitated before handing the tablet to her colleague. 5 minutes later, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special announcement. Would passenger Antonio Reed please come to first class? Our staff will assist you." A ripple of murmurs spread through economy class. Dr. Whitaker smiled knowingly. "Time to reclaim your seat, young man." Antonio gathered his belongings, heart pounding as he stood. He felt dozens of eyes tracking his every move. The weight of their gaze burned, but he kept his head high. His father's lesson echoed in his mind: walk with purpose, no matter the circumstance. At the divider between cabins, Diane Reynolds stood waiting. The gold wings on her uniform gleamed under the cabin lights, a mark of seniority. Her face was carefully neutral, but her eyes carried a quiet urgency. "Mr. Reed, please follow me." She made sure to say it loudly enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. Antonio caught movement from the galley. Linda had reappeared. She froze at the sight of Diane standing beside Antonio. Confusion flashed across her face, then disbelief, and finally the slow, dawning horror of recognition. Diane's voice cut through the tense silence. "Linda, return Mr. Reed's property immediately." Linda's hands trembled slightly as she retrieved the tablet. "There's been a misunderstanding." "Yes, there has," Diane interrupted smoothly. "Mr. Reed will be seated in first class for the remainder of the flight, as per his original boarding pass." Antonio accepted the tablet without comment. For a brief moment, the temptation to smirk or say something cutting burned in his chest. But then just as quickly it faded. His father had taught him that true power lay not in humiliating others, but in maintaining your integrity when others lost theirs. As Diane guided him into first class, Antonio caught Dr. Whitaker's eye. She gave him a small nod of approval, a silent exchange between generations. Across the aisle, the blond-haired boy from earlier watched, eyes wide, as Antonio took a seat. Linda approached, her face pale, her posture stiff. "Would you care for a beverage, Mr. Reed?" she asked, her voice hollow. Antonio met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Water, please." Not cold, not friendly, just matter of fact. Diane pulled Linda aside after serving Antonio, speaking in hushed tones. Linda's complexion paled as she repeatedly glanced back at Antonio. As the flight began its descent into San Francisco, Diane knelt beside his seat. "Your father contacted the airline directly," she explained. "Upon landing, you'll be participating in the board meeting via video conference from our executive lounge." Antonio nodded, processing the information. "May I ask," Diane ventured, "why you didn't simply tell Linda who your father was when she first questioned your ticket?" Antonio considered the question. In the reflection of the window, he could see Linda hovering nearby, within earshot. "My father taught me that respect shouldn't be conditional," he answered. "If I have to tell someone who my father is to be treated with dignity, then that's not really respect at all." The words landed like quiet thunder. Several first-class passengers lowered their gaze, suddenly finding their tablets and magazines fascinating. Linda stood frozen in the aisle, the full weight of recognition finally settling on her shoulders. The pieces connected visibly across her face. Antonio Reed, son of Malcolm Reed, the man whose name had been circulating in company memos for weeks. The same Malcolm Reed who now owned a controlling interest in the airline that had been her employer for 15 years. The same Malcolm Reed whose son she had just publicly humiliated and accused of theft. Her hands gripped the seat back to steady herself as the plane descended through the clouds toward San Francisco International Airport, where consequences awaited. The Aurora Airlines executive lounge gleamed with understated luxury. Leather chairs, mahogany tables, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the tarmac. Antonio sat alone before a high-definition screen where 9 faces stared back at him. The airline's board of directors. At the center of the screen was his father, Malcolm Reed, his commanding presence dominating even through digital pixels. Malcolm's voice carried the controlled power that had made him legendary in business circles. "Ladies and gentlemen, I believe my son has something to share regarding his experience today." Outside the lounge, Linda waited. Her uniform was still pristine, despite the sweat beading at her temples. Security had escorted her directly from the plane to this quiet hallway, where she now stood, expecting termination papers. 15 years of service erased by one catastrophic error in judgment. Inside, Antonio spoke with a composure that belied his 12 years. "What happened today isn't unique," he began. "It's something that follows people who look like me everywhere, from classrooms to shopping malls to first-class cabins." He outlined the incident without embellishment or accusation, simply stating facts. Then, instead of calling for Linda's dismissal, his presentation took an unexpected turn. Aurora Airlines has an opportunity to lead the industry, not just in luxury, but in equality, Antonio continued. "I'm proposing a comprehensive training program focused on recognizing and eliminating bias in customer service." The board members exchanged glances, some nodding, others shifting uncomfortably. "Rather than punishing one employee," he added, "we could transform the entire airline." Malcolm's pride was evident, even through the digital connection. "My son has outlined a 3-phase implementation plan," Malcolm said. "Initial costs would be offset by improved customer satisfaction and reduced liability." The door to the lounge opened. Linda looked up, expecting a security guard with termination papers. Instead, Diane gestured for her to enter. "Ms. Prescott," Diane said, "Mr. Reed would like you to hear this portion of the meeting." Linda stepped into the room, her legs wooden beneath her. On the screen, she saw not only Malcolm Reed, whose reputation for ruthlessness in business was well known, but the entire board, witnessing her humiliation. Antonio continued without acknowledging her entrance. The program would require a consulting team with expertise in both aviation and education. Malcolm nodded, which brings us to our next guest. The door opened again, revealing Dr. Elaine Whitaker. Antonio smiled at her entrance. "Dr. Whitaker isn't just a neurosurgeon," Malcolm explained to the board. She's also served on the Board of Education and pioneered diversity training programs at 3 major teaching hospitals. Dr. Whitaker took a seat beside Antonio. When your son explained his vision during our flight, I immediately saw the potential, she said. This could become the gold standard for the industry. As Antonio and Dr. Whitaker outlined the training framework, Linda stood motionless by the wall. The program they described would transform Aurora Airlines. And it would have prevented her actions earlier that day. When the presentation concluded, the board voted unanimously to implement the program. As members signed off, Malcolm requested a moment alone with his son. Linda turned to leave. Ms. Prescott. Malcolm's voice stopped her. My son believes you should be part of this initiative rather than its casualty. Linda's eyes met Antonio's, finding no satisfaction or vindication there. Only a calm expectation of better. Her voice faltered. I'm sorry. Not because you're Mr. Reed's son, but because no one should be treated as I treated you today. Antonio nodded, accepting her words without celebration. After she left, father and son shared a moment of connection across digital space. You handled that well, Malcolm said. Better than I might have. Antonio's expression turned contemplative. It doesn't feel like a complete victory. Malcolm studied his son. Tomorrow, thousands of people who look like me will board planes, Antonio continued, without a father who owns the airline. Malcolm nodded, understanding the weight his son carried. Which is why this can't end today. 2 months later, Aurora Airlines announced the Reed Horizon Scholarship, a program providing full aviation education, funding for underprivileged youth interested in careers ranging from pilots to aerospace engineering. The promotional video featured Antonio and students from his former school in Chicago, touring cockpits and training facilities. The scholarship's first year would fund education for 20 students who otherwise couldn't afford to enter the industry. At the launch event, reporters pressed Malcolm about the program's origins. He directed them to Antonio. Standing confidently before the cameras, Antonio's voice carried the wisdom born from experience. Everyone deserves to soar, he said. But first, we need to ensure everyone can board the plane. As cameras flashed, Antonio posed a question that would generate thousands of comments online. In a world where respect is often tied to wealth and status, how do we create spaces where dignity is universally recognized, regardless of appearance? The question hung in the air, unanswered, but vital. Much like Antonio himself, suspended between childhood and the leader he was already becoming.